after Ann came to Nebraska in 1972, she began attending the Lower Platte South NRD meetings as an observer for the League of Women Voters. Former Governor Bob Crosby was the first to introduce himself and welcome her to the meeting. During this time, the League of Women Voters also sued the NRD for failing to observe the one person, one vote law. The League lost the suit, but eventually all the NRDs in the state did adopt a one person, one vote election system. Ann continued to observe the NRD both as a private citizen and as an assistant professor doing research on water issues in Nebraska until 1988, when she became the state hydrologist at the Department of Water Resources. When the Department of Water Resources merged with the Natural Resources Commission, Ann became the assistant director and later the director of the department. Ann retired from the department in 2008. In 2012, Ann was elected as the director of the Lower Platte South NRD, and thus Ann has observed the NRDs as a citizen, as a researcher, a state bureaucrat, and as an NRD board member. Please welcome Ann Lee.
Thank you, Amy. It's a real honor to be speaking to this great group of water leaders in the state of Nebraska. This is a group to which I do not need to explain why we need good water governance. It's also a group that I don't need to explain what the natural resources districts are about or how much they have accomplished in the 43 years of their existence. In fact, on the table up front, if you haven't seen it already, you should pick up the brochure that they put out saying what they have accomplished just in the last year. I think you will be impressed. For these reasons, I'm sure it's no surprise to most people in this group that the NRDs have been looked at by many other states as a model that they could use for good governance in their state as well. However, the system is not without its critics. And I believe that if we are truly going to sustain the use of our water resources for not only this generation but for future generations, we need to take these criticisms seriously and look into whether or not they have validity, and if so, what, if anything, we should do to address them. It is in this spirit that when the Delaware Water for Food Institute asked me if I would be willing to do an academic assessment of the Nebraska's Natural Resources District assessment, that I said yes. And as part of that effort, I decided to enlist the work or the help of Christina Hoffman Babbitt, my co-author, who did her dissertation, PhD dissertation on the water governance system in the over-appropriated area of the Platte. As a result of our research, we published the Nebraska Natural Resources District, an assessment, which is the public policy #1 paper for the Doherty Water for Food. I do have, there are some extra copies of here of an early printing. There's some mistakes in that printing, but it is also yours if you choose to pick that up. One of the first problems that we had to decide is how are we going to judge the effectiveness of the NRD system? What criteria should we use? Many people, you look at this map put out by the U.S. Geological Survey of the area weighted average water level change for pre-development in 2013. And they say, compared to Kansas and Texas, Nebraska's done very well. We've only had an area weighted average decline of only 0.3 feet. Therefore, the NRD system is doing very well. Others, however, point to this map and to the red and brown areas and say we have had declines in some areas of our state up to 100 feet. And therefore, the NRD system is not doing very well. I would argue that simply looking at the current status of our water system is, as a judge of whether the system is working well, is way too simplistic. For one thing, a weighted average water level across the whole state does not account for the fact that we do have declines in some areas. Because in other areas, the blue areas, we obviously have some rises, in part due to the importation of water from Colorado and Wyoming. Water that is not, or water that other states could not enjoy having come into their state in such quantities. Another problem we have when you're dealing with groundwater is the lag effect of impacts. For example, for many years we used nitrate fertilizer, but it took us a long time to see the impacts of that use on our groundwater supplies and our drinking water supplies. By the same token, some of the efforts that we are now making to restrict the use of nitrate in fertilizers will have impacts, but it will take a long time for us to realize the full impacts of those efforts. So I would suspect that simply looking at the quality and quantity of our existing water supplies is way too simplistic. So the question then becomes, okay, so where do you look for criteria? And what Christine and I did, we looked to a large volume of research that has been done by economists and political scientists and others on what makes a good governance system for natural resources supplies. In 1968, Garrett Hardin published an article in Science Journal called The Tragedy of the Commons. In this article, Garrett Hardin argued that any natural resource that is held in common, that is not in private ownership, will be overused unless there is a strong force that would make sure that the people did not overuse the resource. Based on his article, many people then said we need central control of our natural resources if we are going to overuse them. However, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. This sentiment was picked up recently in a Supreme Court case, Kansas v. Nebraska in Wyoming, by Supreme Court Justice Kagan. She stated, the Nebraska legislature chose to leave operational control of water use in the hands of district boards, consisting primarily of irrigators who are among the immediate beneficiaries of pumping. No sanctions or other mechanisms hold these local bodies to account if they fail to meet the plan's benchmark. She went on to say, given such a dearth of tools or incentives to achieve compliance, the wonder is only that Nebraska did not still further exceed its allotment. Pretty strong language. Is this true? Do we need central control of our water resources to make sure that they are sustained for the future as well as for current generations? A woman by the name of Eleanor Ostrom, who received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2009 for her work on governing commons, said, not so fast, folks. Eleanor defined common pool resources as a natural or man-made resource that is commonly owned and where one person's use of the resource diminishes the availability of the resource to others. Common pool resources include fishing grounds, meadows, woodlots, and water resources. Eleanor's basic research question was, how can a group of principals who are in an interdependent situation organize and govern themselves to obtain continuing joint benefits from a resource when all face temptations to overuse, free ride, shirk, or otherwise act opportunistically and overuse the resource? Eleanor looked at this problem with using game theory, lab experiments, and importantly, the analysis of hundreds of locally organized districts that have successfully sustained the use of resources for up to 1,000 years. And she came up with a set of guidelines, which she then later revised and added to, and she, and along with a lot of other researchers that followed in her footsteps, have created a great body of research to answer this question. And it was this research that Christine and I turned to, and from that we developed 17 criteria which we believed were important for good governance of our water resources. We applied these criteria using data from the Nebraska statutes themselves, the actions of the NRDs, surveys, news articles, interviews, and lawsuits. And today I will very, very briefly tell you a little bit about what we found. First, some of the criteria were met simply because they were defined the way that statutes define the Nebraska natural resources districts. Recognition of the rights to organize locals was very important to Eleanor Ostrom. Clearly, our statutes do recognize the local control for the natural resources districts. Give that one a check. River basin approach. Holistic planning of multiple resources. The NRD's boundaries were drawn to coincide with surface watershed boundaries. And the NRDs were given a lot of authorities in addition to the authority over groundwater, soils, drainage, fish and wildlife habitat, etc. So they do have the opportunities, and in fact are making use of those opportunities to do holistic water basin planning. And the NRDs also have clearly delineated boundaries. To Ostrom, it was important that the resource being governed and the individuals with rights to that resource are clearly defined. And I think that is true of our NRD system. Then there were a number of criteria that were met because the legislature gave the authority to the NRD to meet these criteria, and the NRDs have taken steps to do just that. For example, rules to prevent over-harvesting. Clearly, the NRDs have enacted rules to prevent over-harvesting, and in fact, I am told by Nick Bozovich from the Doherty Water for Food Institute that the Upper Republican NRD was the first NRD to implement rules to restrict groundwater use in the United States. Another important criteria, congruence between the rules and local conditions. Ostrom emphasized that one size does not fit all. Clearly, our NRDs have implemented rules across the entire state that are different and fit the local conditions. Graduated sanctions. The punishment must fit the crime. The NRDs do implement, and state law supports graduated sanctions. Monitoring. I think you all are very well aware of the extensive monitoring systems that the NRDs have in place to monitor both quantity and quality of groundwater. Adequate funding. Thanks to Senator Carlson, we do have a much big boost in adequate funding. But I did not put a check here because I'm not sure yet whether this funding truly is going to be adequate to meet all the needs of the state in the future. So hold that one. And finally, adaptive management. Adaptive management follows this basic iterative process. You define a problem, develop a management plan, and you develop a monitoring plan. You implement the plan, and you check your monitoring results and find out whether the implementation is working as you expected. If it is, great. If not, then you need to go back and reevaluate your plan. And you can even reevaluate your goals. This provides the ability to experiment, to learn from our failures, and flexibility to make changes. And one of the things that's great about the NRDs is each NRD does its own thing. And if an NRD decides to try a new plan and it works, very often other NRDs follow suit. If it doesn't work, they say, okay, we aren't going to do that one, we'll try something different. So there's a tremendous amount of flexibility in our system and the ability to experiment without risking the whole state going down in flames. Then there are a number of things that are authorized by state law and implemented by NRDs, but it's not quite so easy for state law to say, you shall do this. One of them is communication. We need effective communication systems. Ostrom said, groups that do not communicate well are more likely to overuse the resource. Another, collective choice arrangements or collaboration. The individuals affected by the rules are included in a group which can make and modify them. When this happens, research shows that you have rules that are more creative, they better fit the local conditions. There's more buy-in because the people who made the rules tend to agree with them. And they in turn can turn to their neighbors and friends and say, this is why we need the rule, and it's a good idea for you to follow. There's also better compliance because there is better understanding of why the rule is necessary, and the rule is usually better fit to the local conditions. And better compliance means lower need for enforcement and lower enforcement costs. Equity and procedural fairness. All users need to feel they are treated fairly. Ostrom said, nobody likes to be a sucker. There are two parts to equity and procedural fairness. One is distribution justice, which is a fair distribution and allocation of the resources. And another harks back to collaboration, participatory justice, procedures that provide for fair involvement of all parties in the decision-making process. And finally, all of this needs to be based on the rule of law. Then there's secure tenure rights. This is when the right to the resource, or this indicates that the right to the resource must be secure for the long term. Only if there is security in a water right will people be willing to make investments that depend on having water available. This security, in fact, is the underpinning of the basis of Western water law. And finally, without the assurance of this security, the water resource is likely to be overused. Because if you have no security that you have access to the resource in the future and can't count on it be there, you're going to take what you can get today because it may not be there tomorrow. All of these things are interrelated: communication, collaboration, equity, and security. When one of these things fail, the other seem to follow suit. And the degree to which the various NRDs have met these criteria does vary across the state. Where the criteria have been met, we've had a number of successes. Where they have not been met, we have had, I think, failures, and we've had conflict, and even lawsuits. I will say, however, that based on a lot of the work that Hoffman did, it became clear that development of integrated management plans in the Noble Appropriate Area of the plant, people interviewed and surveyed said that that planning process has really helped with increasing communication and collaboration. As a result of the potential conflicts, or whenever there are such conflicts, Ostrom said there needs to be rapid access to low-cost local arenas to resolve conflicts among users or between users and the officials. In Nebraska, the NRDs very often do resolve local conflicts between users. Unfortunately, however, there are no low-cost statewide mechanisms to resolve conflicts among users, or particularly among users and their officials. And this has resulted, I believe, in lawsuits, which can be costly and often have uncertain outcomes. And the other result is some people either run out of money and cannot continue to pursue the lawsuit, or don't even start the lawsuit to begin with, unless the problems continue to fester. Then there are two items that cannot be legislated or even coerced by state law. However, we believe they are strongly enforced by local control, and these are very important items. One is leadership. A good leader makes difficult choices that are in the best interest of society as a whole, provides overarching direction to constituents, and is willing to be part of the long-term decision-making process. I suspect everyone in this room can look at the management and the staff and certain board members of our NRD system and say they have been good leaders. They have made the difficult choices. They have provided overarching direction, and they have been in this business of the natural resource district management for many, many years. Clearly, in my view, and in Christina's as well, local control has fostered many, many good leaders in this state. And then there is trust. To Eleanor Ostrom, this was the basis of all social institutions. She pounded on the desk and said, only when there is trust can governance well over time. With trust comes effective leadership. You're going to follow a leader you trust. If you don't trust someone, are you likely to follow them? Probably not. Reciprocity, cooperation and effective negotiations, rule compliance, and lowering enforcement costs. However, there is one sticky problem that is always going to be a problem when you're dealing with the local control of a widespread resource. And that is the fact that the impact, and in this case the impact of one NRD, can have widespread impacts on water users in other NRDs. And it's widespread impacts in part because of many areas of our state, the groundwater use impacts surface water supplies. And of course, something the North Platte does can have an impact on the surface water supplies fairly quickly all the way down to the eastern part of the state. But it is also due to the fact that the boundaries of the NRDs do not coincide very well with our groundwater reservoir boundaries. And you can see here in light blue the Great Plains Reservoir, which is shared by many, many NRDs. And likewise, NRDs that are upstream of the groundwater flow, their use can have impacts on NRDs downstream, quite apart from the surface water supplies. The legislature recognized this as a problem. They put in the statute intent language, which said the legislature intends and expects that each natural resources district within which water uses for groundwater management, or, I'm getting ahead of myself, intends and expects that each NRD will accept responsibility for groundwater management in the same manner and to the same extent as if the impacts were contained within that district. They also said with intent language, all involved natural resources districts, the Department of Natural Resources and Surface Water Project sponsors should cooperate and collaborate on the identification and implementation of management solutions to conflicts between groundwater users and surface water appropriators. Now this is intent language. It does not have the force of law. And no doubt this is in part why the Nebraska Supreme Court in the Spirity Ranch case said, although the integrated management law is a step toward reducing future conflicts through general regulation, ideally the legislature would develop a more comprehensive administrative appropriation system, including procedures and remedies to adjudicate direct conflicts between groundwater and surface water users in Nebraska. Now, Eleanor Ostrom also recognized the problems that local control can have when it's applied across resources that are large and expand through the whole state. And for this reason, she said there needs to be a nested hierarchy where local institutions are a part of a larger integrated network with different hierarchies and scales that collaborate with each other to manage the resource. She also said that this system should be balanced. You should not have all the authority at one end and none at the other. In part, she said, because local entities are under intense pressure from local entitlement holders, it is very difficult for them to restrict water rights without the support from higher level institutions. Now, I was curious about this aspect of our system, especially since we have been criticized for having a split administrative system of surface water organized by DNR and the NRDs over groundwater. So I asked the question, is it balanced? And I went around and asked informally a number of people this question. What, if any, role other than regulating surface water should the DNR have in governing the state's water supply? A number of people gave me answers that I expected. And I was particularly interested in the answers from NRD managers, staff, and board members. A lot of them said we need to maintain local control of groundwater, and that the state's role should provide the technical support for us to resolve our problems. However, and much to my surprise, there were more than one NRD manager, staff, or board member that said the following. The NRDs do not always agree, and there are times when the state should be an arbitrator between NRDs. There is a need for overall guidance from the state where impacts extend beyond NRD borders, and where there are issues related to the sustainability of the water supply, and this is what really surprised me. The state should provide a statewide perspective, set a common target and unified expectation of outcomes across the watershed, and then give the NRDs the opportunity to carry out the necessary duties. However, if the NRDs do not meet the targets, the state should have the regulatory power to step in to ensure the targets and the interests of the state are met. I could not help but notice through my years of watching and being involved with the NRDs that in many cases, when a restriction was put in place, people voluntarily did what was necessary, in many cases, to avoid having the restriction actually imposed. This is true for groundwater, restrictions on groundwater use and use of fertilizers. The simple fact that there was a restriction meant gave the incentive for people to do what they needed to do to avoid having that restriction placed on them within the NRD. Same thing is true with the integrated management plans. A lot of NRDs have voluntarily developed their own plan in order to avoid being called fully appropriated. And now I think we are also seeing when we have requirements that certain basins have to do a basin-wide plan, there are a number of NRDs that are also doing their own voluntary basin-wide plan. So this may be a case where a regulation does cause a culture change among the NRDs. So how are we doing in total? As you can see, there are a lot of checks on these criteria. And there's some criteria which vary among the NRDs based on how the individual leaders within the NRD system are operating. And then there's some with the empty circles where I think we are not really achieving as much as we should to meet these criteria. And in part, I believe this relates to the fact that we do not have a completely balanced nested hierarchy. Therefore, one of our recommendations is that the water leaders of the state should consider putting in a few more overarching guidelines which would have enforceability of law to address some of these problems. Then we ask the question, how do we cope with climate change? There's a great body of research out there that is looking at what kind of water governance will it take to address the stresses and uncertainties that will come with climate change. And we looked at these recommendations of this research, and as we listed them and thought about them, we concluded that our system puts us into a very good position to address climate change. For example, transcend artificial boundaries. Our energy system does that. Match governance system to issues and scales appropriate to the problem. Facilitate multiple actors. Provide adequate public participation to add legitimacy to the planning process, increase understanding, and promote trust. Adaptive management, which will allow for experimentation in a way that diversifies risks and allows flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. Our energy system does that, and many other systems throughout the West do not. So all in all, I think we have a damn good system. It encourages initiative and creativity, allows more people affected by the rules to make the rules. It fits the local conditions. The rules are acceptable and more likely to be followed. It increases communication. It generates trust. Or conversely, because it's at the local level, if somebody is not trustworthy, that is more quickly known. And finally, it has developed leaders across the state. However, no matter what kind of laws you have in place or rules, good government must depend to work to develop trust and to provide leadership necessary to ensure that the intent of the law is realized. Now, I want to say that this work I consider to be a work in progress. I would really welcome your thoughts and criticisms. If I've gotten something wrong, I'd like to know about it. If I've gotten something right, however, I will charge you to be leaders in this state, to measure up to the leadership that actually created the NRDs in the first place. Clayton Yiter, Warren Fairchild, Maurice Kramer, Dale Williamson, Jim Cook, who was honored by the NARD, put into the NARD Hall of Fame, and many others. And the leadership of Senator Carlson, who created the Water Sustainability Fund. If you are leaders, you will be willing to make the honest discovery or take an honest look at what about our system is not only right, but may not be right. You will have the political cordiality and courage to have the hard discussions as the leaders who created the NRDs did. And you will have the political will to enact whatever solutions are necessary. Thank you for your time.